Do not come. Do not come.
I'm gonna come.
Ayo, fellas, I've got the gang here to talk about the new upcoming Trump presidency. And we're just going to be talking about this. This is going to be released like a week before Trump gets inaugurated, just so you guys know. So let's go around the room and let everybody introduce themselves, starting with Adam, James, and then Tito Senpai.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for having me on again. It's really great to be back and discussing with everyone. Adam, I'm a Jordanian activist, environmentalist, TikToker. A lot better way than saying unemployed, but we're all fighting the fight as much as we can.
Yeah, hi. I'm James, an organizer in the United States. I am excited to be back. Not so excited about the future of everything, but generally happy to be back on the pod.
Hi, this is Jeff, aka Tito Senpai, but now Tito Comrade. Um, for sake, I organize with the PSL here in Texas.
Nice, nice. Let's begin this. First of all, of course, this was one of the craziest campaign seasons I think any of us have ever seen in our lives. And it was insane. How did we feel about the electoral campaign itself? What were the biggest mistakes that the Democrats made? What gave Trump this absolute win, like the first popular win vote for Republicans in decades? And let's start off with Adam since he's not American, so he's a little bit of an outsider.
No, yeah, I think it was like an extremely interesting campaign, but it's also kind of predictable. I've been kind of seeing it for a while that Trump had the chance or had the majority to win. And for me, the Democrats were fighting, and there was a chance that the Democrats could win, but I couldn't really see it personally. And I think what is happening with Trump kind of coincides with the rise of the far right that we're seeing generally around the world. We're living in an era where inflation is soaring as high as it ever was. People are struggling to find housing. People are struggling to pay their rent. People are struggling to buy their basic necessities of healthcare. And I'm not just talking generally in America, but also, Europe and other parts of the world are currently suffering from this. And I feel like what a lot of people fail to account is the fact that whenever we see this struggle, economic struggles happening, this usually tends to coincide with the rise of the far right and far right authorities and figures, especially, with a charismatic character and leaders such as Trump. They tend to pretty much garner the support of a lot of the people. And I think people were just generally tired of how bad they were doing financially and how bad the economy was. And Trump just basically gave them the premise or the idea that things will be better. They kind of, like most Americans and most people around the world, they're not necessarily too into politics. They just compare their life, how it was before and how it currently is right now. And they saw that, hey, I was living better off 4 years ago. And it's not necessarily that they wanted to vote for Trump because they're Trumpists, but because they're just generally afraid of what the future might hold. And Trump gave them this hope that things will indeed be better. So for me, it was kind of predictable. I don't know per se how much Kamala could have done or the Democrats could have done to win, mainly because of this unprecedented time that we're currently living in. So it's a bit scary, but, I also wouldn't be surprised seeing a lot more far-right figures rising and gaining prominence in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. James, do you want to go next?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think in a lot of ways this was an election characterized, I mean, in terms of the end result, more by voter disengagement on both sides and the scale of disengagement that you saw more so than voter enthusiasm for any particular candidate. We know, based on the 2020 numbers, that the Trump coalition lost several million, I think 3 million overall votes, as compared to 2020. We also know, though, that Harris lost like 12 to 13 million fucking votes in her own coalition from the Biden year. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. I think generally, I mean, there could be entire books written about this, but I think like generally what happened was the Democrats were coasting on the curtails of a 2022 victory that was largely resultant from a reaction to the Dobbs ruling. And they didn't really offer an alternative vision that spoke to the immediate needs of people that were genuinely struggling with high costs of living, with increased costs of food, which you can attribute to, corporate price gouging, what have you, to a large degree, but still, like, you're not adequately addressing these concerns. The Harris campaign was really notable. It was a campaign that was running on things are pretty good, but like we need to avoid the Trump outcome, which is really not a palatable thing when you have people on the streets that are protesting an ongoing genocide, a genocide that is being orchestrated, really, architecturally created by the administration that you're a part of and that the Harris campaign really refused to separate herself from on the campaign trail. It doesn't speak to people who were looking at, the cost of living, who were looking at increased college debt that never got forgiven, people who are really still reeling economically from from the beginning of the pandemic in ways that I think were placated, post Trump, but in ways that ultimately didn't sustain people. And the Harris campaign was talking about a lot of top line macro level indicators without really ever reckoning with the fact that someone might be wrong about like what constitutes inflation and yet still might be right about the fact that they're paying more for eggs at a grocery store. And though the Biden administration made some strides in like labor, admittedly made some, I think, good policy decisions on like the child tax credit and other things, a lot of Americans just feel like they weren't getting enough. And a lot of Americans didn't have a campaign that was either telling them where could direct that blame or telling them that there was an alternative vision that was going to understand what they're feeling and work towards policy positions that address that. And when you have a campaign that is really utterly built around just not being Donald Trump and that is really built around being tied fundamentally to an incumbent that no one fucking likes, I don't see how it's surprising this outcome occurs. I had buddies of mine that were calling it months before this occurred that like the Democrats were setting themselves up for failure in a lot of ways, basically just coasting on the idea that Kamala isn't Trump. But at the end of the day, for a lot of American voters, that's not enough to justify going to the polls because a lot of them don't, they understand that Trump was bad, but they're seeing under Biden their material conditions worsen and these horrible things go on. And you have Harris saying, well, we're maintaining course. And that's not a salient campaign policy or campaign strategy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tito Senpai?
Yo, yeah, I just want to echo what James said. It was largely the result of, people being disillusioned with the whole electoral system, with, as evident by what James says, like the low turnout on both sides, but increasingly more so with regards to Kamala Harris. I think what happened in 2020, there was a lot of, this big push to oust Trump from the presidency, and the Democrats, co-opt a lot of like leftist voices and co-opt a lot of, activists on the ground and the work that they've done to increase voter engagement. But what ended up happening is, the Democrats didn't deliver at all with regards to any of their campaign promises throughout the 4 years. Like, you know, student debt was never canceled. Um, and, we don't have free healthcare. And on top of that, there's that genocide that um, largely and completely backed by the Biden Harris, presidency. So it's hard to run on the moral high ground of not being Trump when you're facilitating a genocide. And at the same time, there is this large, I guess, fleeing from like establishment government. And what the Harris campaign did is, got endorsed by the majority of moderate right wing establishment folks like Liz Cheney and former Bush and Bush and Reagan aides and staffers. And,
Absolutely.
you know, uh, even though like it's not true, Trump still portrays himself as a political outsider and someone that is outside of the establishment. But um, there were more people that believed him as opposed to Kamala. And at the end of the day, it's like to be able to counter something that is extreme far right with like Donald Trump, you can't have a moderate stance. You need something on the opposite end of the spectrum. And that was not what the Democrats did. They catered to the moderates and they catered to the anti-Trumpers, right wingers, and which is increasingly decreasing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think this was a textbook case in how to run one of the worst campaigns in history. I mean, there were so many instances. First of all, of course, the Palestine issue and the complicity within that genocide has loomed over this election cycle, and so has the Ukraine Russo war. I think this election cycle was very similar to that LBJ election cycle in the Vietnam War, where you had this Democrat who was and granted, LBJ was way more progressive than what even the Democrats are offering now. But you had this Democrat who was complicit in genocide, and the Democratic Party apparatus couldn't understand why people would not vote for them despite them being complicit in genocide. And they kept on pushing on that genocide with this sort of egoism. You had this, and it allowed a crazy right winger like Nixon to win, and now Trump. Um, I also think that once again, how stupid was this campaign? I mean, going to Dearborn, Michigan with Bill Clinton and telling Arab voters that your family members have to die. Like marching with Liz Cheney, the wife of the butcher of Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, in front of Arab voters, and saying I'm speaking now when Palestinian activists are saying please stop killing our family members. I think this really highlighted this campaign, just the insane amount of money sent to Ukraine and Israel in useless wars when people couldn't even afford food and people who were working full-time jobs or living out of their cars. It was a completely uninspiring campaign. I'll throw this to the group now. I won't call on anybody, but what lessons should the Democrats have learned from this, and what do you think the Democratic Party will actually do going forward?
I mean, the Democrats aren't going to do fucking anything. They're going to end up blaming their base, and they're going to, they're going to reinforce their entire strategy since 2000, like fucking 16, which is like, we have to somehow shift rightward to appeal to a republic, this mythological moderate Republican base that's going to elevate us to the presidency. And I think some lessons to be learned, though, are, above all else, really, like, don't do a fucking genocide during an election cycle, maybe. But also just broadly, if you want Americans to come to the polls, you have to give them more than antithetical messaging. You have to give them policies that not only exist, but are well communicated to them. You have to be willing to take a stand and like have a spine on key contentious issues that'll drive out progressives and in like urban Democrats who are more likely to vote on behalf of you if you're able to mobilize them effectively. And you need to like ultimately just drop, I guess to some extent, this idea that like there is going to be a suburban, renaissance of democratic politics that is somehow going to make white suburbanites come out in droves to vote for you in a way that is going to compensate for the loss of key voter bases in states like Michigan and Georgia, et cetera, which are seeing like Arab voters, in particular Muslim voters, not turn out nearly as heavily as a result of just key policy positions Democrats refuse to drop.
Absolutely, absolutely. Does anybody else want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think like the direction that might happen in the 2028 election entirely depends on what unfolds within the next 4 years. Because there are also like some talks of maybe Bernie starting a third party, or maybe more prominent third party organizations gaining a greater voice in all of this. And I think depending on whether that happens or not, it could entirely change the Democrats' platform or which direction they could head towards. Because I think it's true. Like this entire campaign, they try to appeal to more moderate voters, more center-right voters, because they know that the voters essentially have no other option but to vote for them. But if they're looking at a serious third-party threat, a more left-wing candidate, then they have to essentially change uh, their entire their entire, outcome and views and proposals and everything like that. And I think that really depends on what happens within the next 4 years. But there's also the chance that Trump is going to do such a horrible job at this presidency that they know they essentially could have it in the bag, because people are going to start realizing how bad of a how bad of a president Trump is, the same way they realized during his previous presidency, and that what kind of gave them the win, or gave Joe Biden the win. So, the Democrats' biggest essentially weapon, their biggest thing that was going for them these past few elections was having far right figures, and that they could just run against. That's why a lot of them prefer running against more far right Republicans than more moderate Republicans, because they know they have a greater chance at winning. And I fear that this same thing might happen again within the next election. But again, it all depends whether a more prominent third party candidate can sway voters and push the Democrats to become actually more left rather than more right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tito Senpai?
Yeah, so what they should learn is that you can't run a campaign just on vibes. You actually have to have policies that, help the working class. But since they are beholden to their corporate donors, they can't and are completely unable to go that route. So it will just be more of the same, but just a different face. Already, we're starting to see names being thrown out there like Fetterman or even AOC, and it's like it's going to be the same messages that it's going to be parroted, but even more right wing, since they lost another election to the MAGA Trump campaign, and they're just going to continue to go further right because their donors are not going to allow them to go move left. And also, what they will learn though is just how successful they were in kicking out third parties from the ballots, both Green Party and PSL, all throughout the swing states of the country. So we're going to see more of the same, more judicial challenges to legit political parties with legit candidates continually being removed from the ballot, and more people be disenfranchised, which I would see a lower voter turnout in this coming election too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the Democrats are sort of the graveyard of any progressive movements. And really, the Democrats always seem to learn the wrong lesson. And of course, it's built into the system. I mean, nobody here is stupid to believe that this is all ideological. Of course, it's based in that great capitalist system. And all the structures around it. But every single election cycle, they always seem to learn the wrong issue. And that's that we didn't go far right enough, right? When Kamala lost, you saw all these MSNBC panels and things like that, like saying, "Oh, it was the trans issue. Like Kamala shouldn't have been so pro-trans," or some of them even saying like, "Oh, it's we just have to accept that Black and Mexican men are sexist, and they would have never voted for a woman," and basically, what the Democratic Party gave us with, I believe, Kamala's VP pick, Tim Walz, was their pretty much wall, right? About how progressive they're gonna go. And that was Tim Walz. Tim Walz was about the best that they will ever give the American people in terms of a, quote unquote, pro worker candidate. And Tim Walz was barely enough for most people. And especially since he was, of course, was not in a position of power. But Tim Walz was barely enough for the vast majority of Americans. In fact, he was not enough. And I think we really saw that in terms of the voter turnout. Um, I'll,
Yeah, let me add something. I also want to point out that a lot of like mainstream media and like prominent Democrats on like social media had been saying that the campaign was too woke and blaming just the unreasonable left within the Democrats. And but it's not entirely true at all. They just want to blame others besides themselves.
yes. I think this is the job of the Democratic Party, though, if you know the ratchet effect, the Republicans go right, and then the Democrats institutionalize that rightward overturn window shift, right? They normalize that. And that's really the job of the Democrats. And we're seeing that again. They're now moving on the quote unquote woke culture. And during their campaign, when they had that racist at the DNC nomination speech, that racist who was part of Trump's campaign, I forget his name, the cop who does anybody know it? The cop who had been pro banning immigrants. Um, that really signified that the Democrats had institutionalized a lot of Trump's racist policies against Mexican migrants, against undocumented people, against illegal migrants. The Democrats are so good at institutionalizing the rightward shift that the Republicans do. It's insane. And we're seeing that once again as they try to shift more right through their little weaselly way instead of actually blaming themselves and being pro workers. I'll throw this to the room now, of course. We've talked about the Democrats. Everybody within the mainstream political analysis has been so confused by the Trump phenomenon. Why do you think Trump is so alluring to his base and so many Americans?
I mean, I think a lot of it, I mean, it's a mixture of factors. Trump is, for all of his shortcomings and all the things that I genuinely despise him for, a very solid orator. He's someone who, even though his speeches oftentimes are rambly and make little to no fucking sense, energizes a crowd. He's someone that if you're like, you know, discontent with the current status quo, is someone who is actively promising you that he will shift it, actively giving you identifiable enemies to rally around, speaking to a lot of base instincts of a rightward base while simultaneously not only legitimizing their concerns, but giving them applicable solutions, even if those solutions are utter dog shit. And I think that speaks to people who have for decades been a part of a political system full of people who are very polished, who are very much not giving serious policy prescriptions in a way that that is similar to Trump, and also a base that has for years been very primed by a mixture of right-wing media, um, internal national dynamics, etc., to be incredibly reactionary. And we've given them a figure who is charismatic, who they can latch on to. I think ultimately that's a big part of the draw, like this idea of Trump's telling it like it is, this idea of him being a figure that people can trust, even though he's as much of a liar as anyone on fucking Capitol Hill, because he speaks a language that people are willing to hear, and he is able to kind of court real support for the policies that he's throwing forward, policies people think will make a real material difference, that they can quantify, and that they can kind of understand and support, even if those policies are, again, just fucking terrible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Adam?
Yeah. I would really agree with James on that one. It's also like the fact that Trump really promoted himself as being essentially anti-establishment. I mean, if you look at the way the early 2000s were to the 2010s, America was getting in a hot streak of military quote unquote interventions, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in Iraq, etc. A lot of people were just tired of, losing their children to like meaningless wars, essentially. And I think that's something a lot of people were just tired of. And especially during the Obama administration, a lot of people were just generally extremely distrustful of the government. They're tired of the establishment. They see people that ran it as just being essentially the same. And then Trump came and started promising all these different things, whether it's pulling the troops out of Afghanistan, whether it's like draining the swamp, so on and so on. They were really excited to have an outsider that can just drag America away from all these things that they believed were holding them back. This kind of establishment. And Trump was really great at that. If like Trump would appeal to every single one of his voters, he would he would talk to like the Arab Americans, saying that, I will end the war in Syria, I will end the war in Iraq, ISIS will be done for. And then he would go to a random village, maybe with 10 people, and give them the same promises. Like Trump tries to appeal to every single voter, whether it's true or bullshit, which is, mainly bullshit. It didn't matter. He tries to appeal to everyone, and then coming this charismatic leader that offers them change because he's essentially an outsider is something that a lot of people just wanted. I think like a lot of people just essentially want change within their country, and Trump just offered that for them.
And it helps that the Democrats really act to legitimize a lot of his positions and just tack right constantly. So every 4 years, he's, to his base, proven right by the very people who are calling him a bigot. It doesn't help.
Tito Senpai?
Yeah. Like Trump is, for better or worse, like charismatic because people believe him being unfiltered is him being honest. Like they view him as not like all other politicians that are lying to the base, as well as, he's addressing the concerns of the people, like both sides. Both sides were frustrated with the fact that the Biden campaign continued to send tens of billions of dollars to both Ukraine and Israel while the economy suffered, while people were living paycheck to paycheck. And he actually was successful in running on an anti-war platform. For whether that's just a lie or not, like he was successful at getting people to believe that. He said, "I will end the Ukraine war in 2 weeks. I just have to have a phone call with Putin, and it'll be settled." And people believed him. And that's the thing. Like he is unfiltered. He is boastful about what he wants to accomplish, as well as he has this unique ability to tap into people's insecurities and desires and be able to magnify them to his benefit. And yeah, every time he speaks, like he is blaming somebody based on what is happening already in mainstream media that people are like latching onto. If his bases are afraid of the migrants, he's going to talk about the migrants. If his base are afraid about the Haitians eating cats, he's going to talk about that. Like he is not afraid to mention whatever is on his mind, for better or worse. And people love him for it because they think he's being honest and not being manipulative like all establishment politicians are. And at the same time, like when you offer an alternative to Trump and they are just basically Trump light, why would they choose Trump light when you can have the real thing?
Absolutely. I also think one great thing about Trump, and I'm not like saying he's great himself, but what's so alluring about him is that he says the C word, the dirty word that you're not really allowed to say in politics, and that's class. He'll actually talk about the working man and the how hard it is to be a worker and how fucked workers are by the American capitalist neoliberal system. And that's something that mainstream politics is really afraid to do, and for obvious reason, because they don't want to acknowledge the C word, the dirty word, the class word, because it means that there is a class warfare. Now, of course, does Trump actually mean that when he says it? No, he's much more like a Mussolini than a Marx, easily. In that, he will use that dirty word, the class word, but use it to protect capitalism itself. He's not actually going to engage in some kind of class war. But he's very good at appealing to the working class of America, especially a disenfranchised working class of America, a white working class in the Rust Belt. That has been fucked over by the neoliberal system. That has been fucked over. Everybody within the working class recognizes that every single year, our condition gets worse, and that our children will be worse off. For one of the worst times for one of the first times in history, America's children will be worse off by every living metric than their parents. And it's all artificially created by the contradictions of capitalism itself. But Trump recognizes that, right? His solutions are bad. His solutions aren't, attack the rich. His solutions are, of course, attack minorities. And when he gets into office, he protects all these neoliberal systems. But he, in rhetoric, gives you a false sense of revolution. And that's very alluring to people who have no other option. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to a Trump voter. I live in an area with a lot of rednecks, and I often talk to them. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to them, and they've said like, yeah, Trump is shit, Kamal is shit, but at least Trump cares about me, right? And it's that um essence of that Trump actually cares about me and will change my condition. I mean, and the Democrats refuse to do that. They want to run in a platform that everything is hunky dory when it's not. At least Trump offers to change, right? Even if it's a shitty change, he offers a change, and I think that's what's so alluring about him. If anybody has any other thoughts and wants to add to that.
Yeah.
I'm
Sorry, Jay, he's good. You start.
you first. You first.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. And I just also wanted to add a bit on this. Is like a lot of far right politicians and generally fascists throughout history went with the same routes. I get that comparing Trump to Hitler or the Nazis has been overdone, But Hitler also or the Nazis kind of did a similar thing by talking about how they wanted to create a revolution, how they wanted to enfranchise the working class, and how they're actually going for the betterment of, the common man, how they want to increase their employment, how they want to help improve their lives. And it's not a coincidence that their rise also coincided after the Great Depression, which is kind of what we're seeing today with these, economic instability. It's just a lot of things historically are currently aligning when the charismatic far right leader during economic desperation and economic instability versus now.
James, do you want to go
Ye-
ahead?
Yeah. Well, in building off of that too, I mean, you do have, I think, kind of discussing a little bit more what you were saying earlier. The United States has always really benefited from being sort of an imperial metropole, right? Where we have really cheap access to consumer goods, to all sorts of things that are really built on the back of hyper exploitation of both resources and labor in the global south primarily. And we're seeing for a long time kind of a violation of a long-standing social contract, which was, yeah, your wages might not get that much better. Yeah, your pension might not get, you might get privatized. Yeah, your retirement might not look as good, but consider the fact that you can get a TV for $100 at Walmart, or consider the fact that your food is cheap compared to like what you otherwise could have. Like Americans for a very long time, I would argue, have been placated as material conditions and a lot of these larger things have kind of collapsed or begun collapsing, have been placated with really cheap access to consumer goods. And consumerism has taken root as a really effective substitute by the ruling class to real material improvements in terms of wages, in terms of healthcare, in terms of debt servicing, things of this nature. And we're seeing kind of a collapse of a lot of those structures. We're seeing cost of living crises. We're seeing housing crises. We're seeing increased indebtedness to especially working class people. And all of those things are culminating in this dynamic where having access to goods isn't even really the biggest incentive anymore. And even those goods are still probably more expensive, or at least are going to be a higher percentage of one's wage overall than what they're willing to be able to what they're willing to tolerate. And as such, you have a population of people who are generally accustomed to having their material conditions met with all of these bells and whistles, these things, who are now reckoning with the fact that that is deteriorating. And when you have a population that is seeing their living conditions deteriorate slowly, or in some instances very rapidly, it primes them for socialism or barbarism or fascism, right? I mean, and we have no real answer on the socialist front that in terms of like a mass party. I mean, we have parties doing amazing fucking work. PSL being one of them. DSA is doing what it can, depending on the chapter. As a DSA member, a lot of fucking frustrations there. Other FRSO, other groups in the US that are doing really solid work, but the legacy of anti-communist agitation in the United States and government crackdowns have led a real void that fascists have been very easily able to fill. And Trump is really the personification of that on like the kind of presidential national level. He's a guy who can talk a good talk. He understands, at least rhetorically, the conditions are getting worse. And he's trying to pitch people on a vision that brings it back to a time where they knew their conditions were pretty damn good. And that's enticing. If you have no counterbalance in messaging and all the Democrats are saying is you're actually wrong, things are fine right now. It's no surprise that we're seeing an upsurge in kind of Trumpist fascistic messaging and successes electorally and otherwise. When you have a system that has really primed people for an outlet, and that only real outlet they're getting in many instances, at least across the board nationally, is going to be fascistic outlets.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tito Senpai, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, just to echo what James says, like we're seeing the dwindling of the U.S. empire, and many Americans are realizing and feeling, they're standing in the world both socially and materially diminishing, and it is, you know, in conjunction with the rise of China in the ways that they have completely took over the supply chain. and as well as the way that they have been investing in the global majority through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is bringing prosperity to those poor countries that has been poor because they have been exploited by Western imperialism. Both in the extraction of resources and the extraction of labor, which, as James says, have placated the American working class for a long time. Just like the Labor Party in the UK are not anti-imperialists because they benefit from British imperialism. In the same way, I think we are starting to realize that in the US that um, how we benefited primarily from imperialism, and how since U.S. Empire is diminishing, um, we're not able to placate, or we're not able to have those cheap consumer goods and higher standards of living. And Americans are seeing that. Americans are seeing how other countries and other people are starting to do better. And Trump's message is "Make America Great Again." America first. Well, I will, impose these tariffs on these other countries, so that way we'll eliminate the trade deficits. I will and lower our prices and bring industry back to America. And it's the message that Americans want to hear, and that's how he's able to capitalize on it. Never mind that tariffs don't work, and never mind that he is putting war hawks in his boards. Like he is saying one thing and doing another thing, but they are clinging to any hope that is available to them outside of the typical establishment and typical talking points that the Democrats always push forward.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned China because globally, we have seen America sort of falter from its post-Soviet collapse status, right? After the Soviet Union collapsed, we got this era of neoliberalism, and it was wonderful for the capitalists. All tariff protections were gone. All national borders were pretty much almost gotten rid of, and free trade was able to flow as much as possible. And of course, almost all of the world was proletarianized. Even the most isolated economies suddenly became incorporated into this global super economy as America got a unipolar grip onto the world. But with the rise of China and de-dollarization, we've sort of seen this shift. And so I just want to throw it out there. How do we feel? What do we think Trump represents for the future of the American empire in terms of how it's been operating previously under this neoliberal free trade sort of ideology, and towards a future in which possibly tariffs are happening, in which possibly it's more protectionist? Does this represent a new upcoming trend within the West itself? Is this unique within America? How do we feel about this new face of the Western empire and global capitalism that Trump represents?
Gotcha. Yeah, no, Trump represents, I feel like, what both political parties, the people of the political parties, um, feel like the real enemy is of the U.S. empire. Like right now there are people that are like, liberals that are against the U.S. Backing of Israel genocide in Palestine, and there are Republicans and right wingers that are against, the war with Russia, and Trump is capitalizing on that by saying, we should face China as a real enemy. And he started this all the way back in 2016 with the trade war with China and being hard on China. And I think, you know, the propaganda in America about China still works. I feel like a lot of the propaganda around like Israel and even around Russia is starting to unravel. But there's this genuine fear, I feel like, that based off of American propaganda about China. And
Mm.
Trump represents being tough on China. He is, actively talking about China, actively blame the pandemic on China, actively, makes fun of Xi Jinping. Um, and, you know, people are wanting America, to be great again. And that's why they voted for him this time around. They view it as a zero sum game. Like they view it if America's not number one, they're last. Like Talladega Nights. If you're not first, you're last. But what China aims to do is build a multipolar world of like collaboration, and America views it as a zero sum game. And yeah, that's what I have for now.
Oh, absolutely. James, did you come
Please.
to answer? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that largely. I think Trump is kind of the culmination of decades of American anxiety around the erosion of U.S. hegemony internationally. And the kind of question that a lot of Americans have no doubt asked themselves over the past decades of where are we? What role do we play? And, are we still at the top of a proverbial pyramid that we had established and maintained, really, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union? And I think a lot of Americans are deeply anxious about the reality in which they might not be the sole top dog, the sole arbiter of international affairs, the sole kind of gravitational point for all discussion and discourse and economic growth and leverage, etc. Even if they're not able to identify that necessarily, I think there's just the toxic element, one of many, of this concept of like American exceptionalism and the end to history as we know it with the collapse of the Soviet Union and kind of the dominance and resurgent dominance of capitalism, is that we never really, like, a lot of Americans have never really wrestled with the core foundational principles of and really the core foundational harm that results from being atop of a kind of system built on blood, subjugation, etc., but do know, at least on some level, that we benefit from it. And this erosion of our general power, our erosion of like political power on the international stage, the failure of allied parties, etc., is leaving a lot of Americans to wonder if they might at some point be the exploited rather than the exploiter, even if it's on a subconscious level. This idea that like if America's not on top, we become the people that are bombed, we become the people who are exploited, we become the people who are considered second rate and subhuman, because that's the norm that's been established by US hegemony. And I think that, when you see all of that and you have someone like Trump who's saying, no, I didn't vote for the Iraq war. I'm going to get our troops out of these stupid boondoggles that are testing our national resolve. I don't want there to be what have you. It's embarrassing for the Democrats, actually, that Trump was able to come in as a peaceful dub candidate. That's fucking insane. But the fact that he's been able to is a fundamental failure of the Democratic Party and American establishment at large, because he's able to come in and say, look, I get it. You're anxious. The world doesn't take us seriously anymore. Like, we're falling out of our glory and, disregarding what that glory entailed, really, the human toll of it all. But saying, I'm going to put us firmly back on that pedestal so no one questions where we stand. And then, the only people standing up against him are, in the establishment side, are people whose voting legacies largely embroiled us in some of the worst fucking either defeats or embroiled conflicts that we've seen in decades. And that's, where that comes out, I think.
Absolutely. Adam, do you want to go?
No, sorry, I just kind of entirely lagged out throughout most of this conversation. I just re-entered. I switched to my hotspot, so I'll get you kind of just to get him the question.
What does Trump represent for the future of the American empire? Oh, did he lag out again?
Yeah,
Oh.
I think it's kind of really interesting. Am I lagging out again?
No, you're back. Oh, okay. Let's see.
I do like who's
Oh, you well now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. Yeah. Essentially, like what we're seeing now with Trump, he's gonna essentially change, I think, the entire fear of America, because what we're kind of seeing happening a lot with America is a lot of underfunding of a lot of sectors, a lot of different, you know, places within different communities and different countries, especially when we're talking about, let's say, education or healthcare or infrastructure. And, and without a doubt, like the trade deficit is going to run up even higher. And I think like what we're kind of seeing now is a slow collapse of an empire, the same way we're talking about the Roman Empire, for example. Because when people talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire, there wasn't a set point where, or a definitive date where we can say, oh, this is the collapse of what we know as the Roman Empire. It just kind of happened throughout time. There isn't a set place, and it's kind of mirroring what's happening within the United States itself, underfunding of certain communities, establishments. And I think it's kind of going through a downward spiral. And if we're seeing potentially another, let's say, war in Taiwan, they're going to be running up an even higher deficit. And with these tariffs, competition is going to become even more more difficult, and it's going to become more difficult to keep up with rising empires happening everywhere. Because what is also happening, let's say, with Russia, for example, and especially with all these sanctions that have been imposed, is that it consequently strengthened the enemies of the United States. It's made Russia develop stronger alliances with China, with North Korea, with Iran. And what if the same thing happens with China, then we're going to be essentially seeing the same thing, which is allies such as the BRICS, for example, becoming an even stronger force to be reckoned with, which is going to become too expensive to maintain, at least for the United States.
Yeah, I know
I
James.
hope everyone heard what I said, by the way.
Yeah, we did. I know James wants to go, but I'll just add something really quick. I think after the collapse of the Soviet Union, American capitalists pretty much got the world, right? They took over the whole world. They got everything that they ever wanted. And then just like capitalists do, and just like capitalism does, it ended up eating itself, right? It ended up gorging itself on its own system. And it needed, once again, new crises to keep itself going. And one of those biggest crises was really, in the midst of 2001, the World Trade attacks, was the Iraq and Afghanistan war. And what those really did, I think, was set a rot within the neoliberal system that was present already, but really set a rot within the core, as tons and tons of money that could have been spent on healthcare and infrastructure and education within the imperial core itself was spent on bombing Iraqi civilians in Fallujah and Afghani civilians who didn't even know what 9/11 was, right? Like these poor villagers in the middle of nowhere who had never even heard of America before. And essentially, this rot has just continued on and on and on, where nowadays, even though they've already gotten grasp of the world, they need to redivide the world even more, right? With the rise of China, as China has taken Africa in terms of trade, it through a much more peaceful route, right? Like a much more peaceful route than Western imperialists ever did, and a much more equal development than Western imperialists could ever promise, which is so alluring to the global South. As China has sort of almost become a new world power, they need to redivide the world once again. They need new markets. And so they've started a war within Ukraine to reassert their grip over Ukrainian assets. They started a war in Palestine to reassert their grip over Middle Eastern assets. And so what Trump really represents is a rot that is just growing and festering. And so the days of, this open neoliberal dream where tariff and, open trade is completely gotten rid of, and we have these multinational corporations that are completely stateless and able to operate everywhere, is sort of dying. And we are now entering a more ugly phase of capitalism, as Lenin called it, that imperialist, interwar stage of capitalism that starts world wars. James, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the exact same thing. I think in a lot of ways, Trump represents a sort of, like you had said, a rot or a decay of both American hegemony and the larger system. And I think that one of the things we're going to see decades down the line, God willing, we make it that far, is a real analysis of Trump having been a candidate at the helm for the real death spiral of American empire and a real death spiral of American hegemony. Someone who is very, very keenly trying to keep themselves, to maintain course or steady the ship, who sunk it in the result of his policy decisions and the after effects of those decisions themselves. I think Trump is someone who is being put in a way to reinforce America's hegemonic position and reinforce American kind of good old boy politics, who's simultaneously probably going to steer the ship directly into a fucking rock. Not to say I don't relish in that a little bit, but it's definitely something to consider.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tito senpai?
Yeah, I think Trump represents the uh, continual ransacking of our civil rights as well as the public goods of this country. I saw that there was a bill recently introduced to the floor of the Congress, uh, getting rid of the Department of Education and getting rid of the Department of Consumer uh, Finance or Consumer Protection. I I think what we'll see Trump do is continue down the same route that he took in 2016 of trying to privatize everything and giving more control to corporations, even with the Department of Government Efficiency. That's their task to fire. They literally said they will want to follow the Malay Argentinian method of getting rid of so many public servants, so many government workers, in order to try to balance their debt, but that's not gonna solve it. Like, it's gonna continue to make things worse for everyday, American workers and continue to, diminish, like, America's, social standing internationally because they are so weak domestically and, you know it's even more ripe for greater discontent and, if we continue down this route, I believe we'll see a civil war and World War III in our lifetimes. It's just a matter of which comes first.
Mm, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing about the capitalist system. It just engorges itself. Like, it's disgusting. It cannot even give us, our children, education or food in its mouth because of its falling rates of profit, because of how competitive it is. It constantly needs more and more profits for this beast, and it's just disgusting. It's a decadent society, right? That's what America is currently. It's a decadent society that is just engorging itself to death, and the people running it at the helm are just shooting themselves in the foot, but they need that short-term quarterly a profit. They need that short-term quarterly income, whatever you call it, just so and in doing so, they are sacrificing all of our futures, our children's futures, our grandchildren's futures. It's such an insane society with so much bloat in it too. The Pentagon, billions of dollars just going nowhere. It's a society that can no longer even run itself efficiently because of so many leeches. I'll say, um, the rest of the world is looking at the rise of China and the Trump presidency in America. What do you think the Trump presidency in America means for America's global standing? Will he somehow manage to get us back to our hegemonic position, or will he continue that rot and downward spiral? And do you think most of the world will side with China, or are they still so engrapped by America and American capital? Tito, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think it'll be more of the rot. I mean, as we saw in the first Trump presidency, he isolated a lot of America's allies. And, you know, as soon as Trump was elected, even the EU/NATO were already having contingency plans if he cuts off funding in their war with Ukraine. And at the same time, like since Biden had already and no, not just Biden, but every American president has weaponized and continue to weaponize the dollar. And Trump saying that everyone that doesn't trade with the U.S. dollar will be sanctioned. Like it's going to be more isolation. Like Trump is just going to be louder about America first, and in doing so, continually pass policies and continually spout rhetoric that will further drive allies and enemies and potential allies further away from America.
Absolutely. Adam, do you want to go? Or let's see. Is he still blocked? Let's see. Is he still buffering? James, do you want to go then?
Yeah, I mean, oh, I think Adam might be back.
Let's see. No,
Oh,
James, go.
maybe not. Something I think is notable is that the standing of the U.S. has really. I don't know how much it'll be influenced by someone like Donald Trump. I don't know how much U.S. standing will really be influenced by any single president. I think the real understanding that many actors, both state and non-state actors, have in the United States is that regardless of the leadership at the top, it's the bureaucracy and those within it and the systems and the kind of like institutions at play that have the real power and they're going to be making the real decision making. There very well may be a situation where Trump makes us more outwardly um, intimidating or something of that sort, or maybe, alternatively, just outwardly ludicrous to a point of absurdity. But I think what's really going to be the core calculation of a lot of state and non-state actors is that regardless of whoever the fucking leader is, the generals largely stay the same, the State Department largely stays the same, the DoD largely stays the same, the military apparatuses don't change too much. And I think realistically, that's going to be the calculation being made. Is that it's the same demon with a different face, and that they just have to coordinate around what might be a very, for lack of better words, egocentric leader who is still going to be manning one of the most powerful and deadly military forces on the entire planet. And I think that's the real calculation a lot of them are going to be making.
Interesting. Interesting. Adam?
Yeah, yeah. I would have to agree with James as well. I mean, like, America has essentially like still not gotten over its imperialistic height or how powerful it used to be uh in its standing in the world, you know. You compare how America was in the 90s versus how America kind of is today, they're still in a bit of the illusion that they're still during this height and they're still able to not only maintain their imperialistic empire, but also expand it, especially with everything that's currently happening in the world. I mean, they have bases everywhere, almost everywhere around the world. And not only do they have to maintain these bases, but they have to keep prices at these bases the same. They have to continue funding them. And now we're also seeing wars popping out in Ukraine, in Israel, and potentially more more coming on with the war, potential war in Taiwan, maybe another potential war in Iran. Um, and these things are expensive, extremely expensive to fund. And the United States is already running out of basic ammunition. It's already having a difficult time continue funding this without sacrificing um the livelihood and of their own people and of their own country. They still are under the illusion that they are able to maintain this while still maintaining a good economic situation, social situation back at home without realizing that it will potentially backfire on them.
Absolutely. And I don't even think they care about it backfiring. Tito, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to like point out that Trump's cabinet picks are extremely concerning, and specifically with his pick for his nominee for Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Like he is someone that is a complete outsider and doesn't have the competency for the job, and regardless of how bad Lloyd Austin was, he was still a general that was there by merit. So I feel like in this Trump presidency, Trump is seeking to remove a lot of the breaks and the frictions that he experienced in his first presidency. I feel like it'll be a lot more volatile this time around, especially with the Department of Defense. If Hegseth does get nominated and is takes over, like their plan is to basically purge a lot of the generals in the US military.
Right. Right. And honestly, I think within the 2020s, the US empire, for the first time in a long time, say maybe the Vietnam War, has been absolutely humiliated. I mean, humiliated. We were forced to pull out of Afghanistan, and our backed government there collapsed within weeks, months. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, we were telling ourselves, news channels, everybody, that this war will be over in months, in weeks, and yet it's dragged out so long. We put sanctions on Russia, and Russia got around those sanctions through India and China. America used to mean something, right? When you heard that America was going against Russia and Ukraine in the 90s, when you could sort of say America was at its peak, that would have been a very, very scary proposition. And now it's floundering, and this is not to be pro Russia whatsoever, but it's floundering in its sanctions. It's floundering in its military force. It's floundering in the oomph that the American empire used to have. It's no longer the scary big dog that it used to be. And that's because so many alternative systems of support, like BRICS and the Chinese Belt and Road, have been created, where now, America no longer has that ability to completely come in and crush anybody that goes against it. It's almost like a school bully who's outgrown, who's an old man now. He's like, he still has that school bully mentality from that elementary school, but his muscles are withered. He cannot hit with any of the force he can anymore. It's a very sad sort of thing to see, if it wasn't kind of, I mean, almost hilarious. It's comedic and sad. Do you think, and I'll throw this to the room now, do you think Trump will be different from his last presidency, or do you think it'll be more of the same?
Well,
Um, go ahead, James.
no, no, you first, you first.
Um, I mean, I just wanted to like Trump during this presidency, at least he's more well aware of his role, of what he is able to do, and his limits within the presidency. Because during his first term, he was still kind of figuring stuff out. He was still trying to establish himself. But now we're 4 years later, and Trump is in a much stronger standing than he was 4 years ago. He's able to appoint a lot more judges in his favor. The idea of MAGA Trumpism is a lot more prominent than it was 4 years ago. And he definitely has a lot more support, not just within the people, but within judiciary powers as well. There's a lot more judges in favor of him. And now we're going to be seeing him essentially with also Project 2025 try to reinvigorate and reshape America as it is. And potentially now also with the Supreme Court, him adding maybe another two judges or replacing two current judges that will last there for God knows how long. His standing within America is going to become much more powerful. And he's going to be having a lot less restriction um, in his presidency than he did 4 years ago. Now, whether he is actually competent enough to do anything that drastic or anything that different is a different story. But, at the end of the day, he's still a narcissist. He still doesn't take, I think, his job as seriously. He's in it mainly for uh, just his improving his image as what narcissistic leaders do. But, he definitely won't have the same challenges that he did 4 years ago trying to push a lot of his policies and a lot of his agendas.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and even building off of it too. I mean, Trump had a constraint in 2016 that he doesn't now, which is the threat of reelection. Like, he doesn't have to think about that now. He is a president who doesn't have to think every decision that he makes is not going to be marred with the question of, will this affect my reelection campaign? Because he doesn't give a shit about the next guy. I mean, he really doesn't. I mean, Trump is not someone who's setting up a political dynasty for the Republican Party. He doesn't care. And I think ultimately we're going to see a more unhinged, probably, I guess, truthfully, more honest governance from Trump wherever he's able to have it. The fact that Republicans are also taking the House and Senate is not going to make it better. But I don't know. I mean, we're at this weird point where we're essentially banking on Republican defections for the worst policy outcomes, which has never been something that's good to bank on. And I don't know what that's gonna mean for like the policies. But I know that if I were Trump and I'm looking at this and I'm saying I want to push as much stuff through as I can in 4 years, not going to get another chance, and I've got the entirety of Congress and the Supreme Court on my team, I mean, I'd be pushing through some crazy shit, you know.
Oh, absolutely. Tito senpai?
Yeah, like what you said in the beginning of this podcast, like the Democrats are good at institutionalizing the right wing movement of America. And there is a lot of things that was absurd during Trump's presidency has become commonplace now in the United States. Things with regards to the border and things, the backlash against DEI and affirmative action. Like a lot of those things that were completely absurd during the first Trump presidency is in place now, and I think he will continue to, yeah, figure out how, as what James said, to pass his policies, especially since they have a supermajority, both in the House and the Congress, as well as in the Supreme Court. Like we're going to see more of his policies as well as the policies actually the donor class wants get passed. And, it's a scary thought and it's going to get a lot worse in America because of it.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I will say is when Milei was elected in Argentina, everybody was saying, "Oh my God, look at this idiot! Look at this buffoon." But I think what people really forgot to realize was that it doesn't matter that Milei is in office. What matters is that Milei represents one of the biggest cash grabs by the Argentinian bourgeois in history. Right? It was an open frenzy by the Argentinian bourgeois to get rid of whatever workers' protections, whatever concessions the Argentinian state had given them and grab onto those assets, grab onto those profits as quick as they could. It was like a frenzy, and that's what Malay really represents. And South America has always sort of been in a laboratory for our future economic policies. With the Pinochet government really establishing neoliberalism. I think really what Trump is going to be is another sort of Malay, in that it's going to be an open cash grab moment for the bourgeois. They're going to be set loose. They're going to be allowed to basically eat up America as much as they can. And it might even get to a point where it's unstable. Most likely, I'm banking on it, them grabbing enough and leaving just the littlest bit that it's still stable. There's going to be still enough countermeasures, counterbalancing measures within the liberal system that all liberal systems have to remain somewhat stable. But it's going to be ugly. It's going to be like pigs at a trough, as they just gorge up whatever they can. And that's what Trump really represents. You really got to stop looking at Trump, and his stupidities and his, funny words and his meme content, which is, I mean, I must say, I absolutely laugh at that. It's comedy gold sometimes. I get caught up in that. But you really have to look underneath the curtain, and underneath the curtain, there is just a starting line being created right now. And the second Trump's presidency goes into effect, it's all go. It's all the race starts to just grab whatever you can, and then the Democrats will come in and institutionalize this, normalize this, make this normal within the American overturn window. Um, there's been a lot of talk about Trump's cabinet picks. Of course, there's been memes, there's been laughs, there's been horror. What do we think about Trump's cabinet pick, and what effect do we think that they will have? I'll just throw it to Adam.
Yeah, I think like one of the most interesting things is Elon Musk because it's still a bit unsure about all the other takes or whether they will get passed or not. But I think Elon Musk is the most interesting one because you have two narcissists in office. You have Trump and you have Elon Musk, two guys who I don't really think like each other, but they understand how their work is mutually beneficial. But I do think this will eventually backfire. Uh, and possibly deteriorate the relationship. And we might see a huge fallout that will have huge implications, maybe for Elon or maybe for Trump, that could divide the base. And I think this is one of his most important alliances because, what's his name? Elon really helped invigorate a lot of support for Trump, whether it's through Twitter or, these other bases. But I can't possibly see this relationship heading in a good direction. No matter where I try to look at it, these two will definitely clash. Their interests are going to not, they're going to clash at some point during this presidency. And then there's other picks, like other billionaires who have no idea what they're doing in their job. And it's basically turning into an oligarchy, and this never really works out. So I think one of Trump's biggest downfalls are his potential cabinet, and are his potential picks, you know?
Absolutely. James?
Can you reiterate the question for me really quick? I forgot in listening to that.
Oh, okay. No issue. What do we think about Trump's cabinet picks and what effect do we think they will have?
I mean, they're about the level of chaos I would have expected from the Trump admin. Admittedly, it's like absurd to a degree. I think what's happening more than anything is Trump isn't necessarily thinking tactically with his picks. I think he's just doing what a lot of administrations historically, all of them have done, except in a lot more blatant fashion, which is utilize his patronage network to put people in their positions that he knows he can rely on and weren't going to fuck him over. In a cruel way, it makes me wish I would have said something nice about Trump like 2 years ago on fucking Twitter because I probably would have gotten a cabinet spot. But it's what it is at this point. But I think again, the heads are going to be the heads of whatever operations they're doing. But it's the bureaucracy at large that I'm more interested in, and I don't think that's going to seriously shift under any of these people. I think some departments might get shuttered. There might be some hiring freezes or operational directives, but a lot of this is going to be, a lot of the work that's done in the US government isn't done by the people in charge. It's done by hundreds, if not thousands, of low and mid level bureaucrats that are going to be putting in the work and maintaining the ship as best they can, or just acting in whatever interests they can align with. They're going to keep them in their jobs for as long as possible. So I don't see there being a massive threat the people that are going to be put in. I think that some departments like the DOE, the Department of Education, is probably like pretty fucked. But I don't know past that. But I could completely eat shit on that one in a year or two. We'll just have to see.
Oh, absolutely. I am absolutely predicting a war between these heads of these cabinets and the bureaucracies that are in them. Tito Senpai?
Yeah, basically, Trump nominated a lot of, his billionaire friends, or nominated what his donors told him to nominate in certain position. Linda McMahon, who is the CEO of World Wrestling Entertainment, as the, education secretary. Like, it's so comical and completely absurd, but like it's completely lockstep with who Trump is and what he's been known to do. I think one thing that we should look at is I forgot who he nominated to oversee the U.S. Postal Service back in his first term, but U.S. Postal Service was completely gutted to where now, before, people who work at the post office were like middle class, upper middle class, was able to make a living for themselves. But now there are postal workers that are living out of their cars and are, houseless. And I think, everyday people will, suffer more through the deterioration of these government agencies. For example, like gonna nominate Dr. Oz, who ran for Senate under privatizing Medicare and Medicaid services, to lead the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Like as you said, it's a free for all for the American bourgeoisie, and it's going to be uh, um, feasting on the remaining carcass of the U.S. empire to the detriment of everyday working class people.
Absolutely. And I think with Doge, which is the stupidest fucking name I've ever heard, it's gonna be a war, right? Like these cabinet heads are gonna be clashing with this bureaucracy that's already set, as James mentioned. And especially as they try to cut these jobs and this bureaucracy comes to a head. The people that are going to suffer the most aren't the generals and the Mike Pompeos and the real helms of the American state. They're going to be average people. They're going to be postal workers. They're going to be teachers. They're going to be people, city workers. These are the people who are going to feel the real effects of this war between an established bureaucracy and these heads. And it's going to be absolutely ugly, of course. But I also think they have a real good chance of winning, of getting it to guide towards a way that shifts the American overturn window to the absolute right. Because again, this is the bourgeois' chance to eat America. So I'm just gonna throw this to I'll throw it to Adam first. We're just sort of predicting it right now. What do we think America will look like in 2028 when all is said and done, when the Trump presidency has had its time to set in, do its actions? Just some off the bat predictions of what we imagine it will be like. Of course, we might be right, we might be wrong, we'll see. So Adam, go ahead.
I mean, the economic consequences of, let's say, tariffs and potentially whatever else he's planning, because he's still catering towards the billionaires and the bourgeoisie. A lot of it, some of it will be felt within the first few years, but a lot of it I don't think will be felt until maybe like 10 years later or 20 years later. I mean, a lot of the effects of Ronald Reagan's presidency is now or like only recently starting to show effect. But I think socially, for example, is going to be the biggest change. I think um, Trump is going to become a lot more extremist than he was 4 years ago. And I think a lot of the excuses that people have currently for Trump about how he will revolutionize the country, create more jobs, is going to completely backflip. And I think it's all going to be an even greater shit show. I think this is going to push people further to the side of the Democrats. And essentially, this is why Joe Biden won, is because they were hoping for a new change like Trump, realized, no, it's pretty shit. It's not really a good time we're having, and then switch back to a Democrat. And during the time of the Democrat, we could potentially see another economic recession, inflation being even higher, which again will probably be blamed on the Democrats because this is how the Republican Democrat cycle continuously goes. But I think in 2028, we might not see that greater effect except a more divided nation. But, the long term consequences economically will be felt decades afterwards.
Absolutely, absolutely. James.
I agree with that. I think, we're probably going to see a lot of chaos under a Trump administration economically and socially and otherwise. But a lot of the long term effects are going to be felt 10, 15 years down the road, after Trump has left office, leaving whatever Democrat probably wins in 28 to deal with whatever's, whatever the fuck is happening at that point, as Republicans are ones to do. And I think that a lot of the real devastation is going to be long term. It's going to be a lot more structural, and it's going to lead to a lot of people either not being able to get basic services, a lot of issues with already failing or outdated infrastructure, a lot of just general problems in communities, production wise, the ability for them to get jobs, things of that nature. It's going to be stuff that we see on a macro level that's going to be really acutely felt, probably particularly in like the Rust Belt and in rural communities. And in cities as well, I guess, to a lesser degree, but there's a level of insulation in some of those cities due to like local governance and what have you. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be really messy, but I agree. I think a lot of the worst effects are probably going to come 10, 15, 20 years down the line. And then we're all going to be just pointing fingers at Trump or whoever the fuck's in office, trying to figure out how we fix it.
Absolutely. Tito Senpai.
Yeah, just to echo what they said, it's like going to be socially chaotic and volatile, but the long term effects, like we will, only begin to realize it like after his term. Just like we're looking back at, what Trump has done in his first presidency and feeling it. That's the same thing that's gonna happen. At the same time, what will definitely happen is just liberal suddenly waking up again and wanting to organize and wanting to quote unquote resist and be loud against the government and honestly start co-opting actual leftist movements again. Like the same thing that happened in 2020. It'll be the same thing that will happen in 2028. Like it I believe liberals will be even more insufferable in the fact that the way this election ended, like they were so loud about blaming, leftists and third party voters, and even saying like, "Yo, I hope Trump finishes the job in Gaza," and this is what you voted for, and it's just going to be insufferable from both like blue MAGA and red MAGA.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think Trump will once again shift the overturn window right, and then whatever Democrat comes in 2028 will take some half measures to reverse a little bit of what he did, but mostly institutionalize whatever Trump did during his 4 years. And then, of course, as everybody's been saying, we will feel those institutionalized effects years and years later. Again, like harkening back to what I said, this will be the bourgeois gorging on America, and through judge appointments, through additions to the bureaucracy, through changes to the way that the American government is run for better profits for a couple billionaires, and everybody else absolutely getting fucked over. It is not going to be a fun couple of years, but also it's going to be chaos socially, but it will be a little bit stable economically. But 10, 20, 30 years from now, we're going to feel all of these effects very, very hard. Um, I, w- Moving on, this is going to be a really, really make it or break it time for the American left. What do we think the American left should do during these 4 years in which Trump is going to be in office? Adam, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think a lot of I think leftist coalition fail to realize is um they always try to push for the presidency, always try to mobilize when it comes for like a greater office or a greater presidency. And I might be wrong, but I don't see a lot of mobilization when it comes to smaller offices, whether it's state congressional congresses, state senates, or for example, even their congressional offices. I think like the most important thing that the left should be doing is trying to put a more progressive person into not necessarily the highest position in office. They could try to go for some congress, some senate, some mayor office or something like that. Small building steps. I think a lot of people just want to find the solution immediately. Like someone, for example, like, yeah, we have to mobilize for Jill Stein, for example, because this is our only hope. I'm like, I get it, but it's also, it's steps. You can't expect to find a solution immediately, even by having a small minority in Congress for a leftist coalition could have great implications. We're already seeing it, for example, with um this small Republican MAGA caucus. What are they called? I think the Freedom Party, with Marjorie Taylor Greene and those group. They created a really big problem when it came to electing a new leader for Congress, for ousting McCarthy and putting a new person in power. And even a small coalition of 20, they had a lot of power, they had a lot of force. So even if leftist coalition are able to get 10 people into Congress or 15 people into Congress, they could still hold a lot of power and they could still change a lot of things. Because what is now the results of Congress? I think there's like a 6 seat majority. I think it's pretty much the same as it was 2 years ago. So like even having a small minority of leftists that some, like most of the time, do side with the Democrats, but still are able to change policy outcomes or force the Democrats to compromise more with the left is essential. Because, like we said before during this podcast, the Democrats aren't going to change. They're also influenced by the bourgeois. They're also influenced by corporations. They don't have the interest of working class Americans in mind. Even if they're a bit less right than the Republicans, there needs to be a more prominent leftist coalition that is active and that can at least, strong arm the Democrats into pushing more progressive policies into office. So I think that's what the current leftist coalition should be working for. Maybe small congressional districts, try to get someone they trust into power.
James?
No, actually, on a more broader topic, I am curious as to what the liberal response really is going to be to Trump in 24, because coming back to something that was noted earlier, the liberal response to Trump losing or Trump winning has kind of been to blame quote unquote woke elements of the kind of big tent that Democrats have always kind of at least rhetorically stated exists. And I actually firmly believe that even if Trump would have lost, we would have seen the same rhetoric and the same shifts away from any kind of like left wing coalitional model. And I think what scares me, I think, or what I guess not scares me because like ultimately the work is being done without liberals already in so many instances, but what interests me is going to be whether or not liberals themselves actually do organize at a scale that we saw in like 2019, 2020, and a scale that we saw in 2016. I'm not sure if they will. Like, I genuinely wouldn't be entirely surprised if we saw liberal groups, fundraising aggressively, doing their little targeted campaigns for whatever, but I don't know if we're gonna see, like, even the women's march kind of stuff that we saw in the, post-2016 landscape. It's just, something I've been thinking on a lot because I actually don't know how aggressive liberal mobilization will be to Trump when their own base just seems deflated and really not willing to fight a lot of Trump rhetoric even on the border at this point.
Absolutely. Tito senpai?
Yeah. I think first thing I'm thinking about is not fall for the Bernie Sanders third party that he's trying to build. This is the guy that um basically tried to fit in with the establishment of the Democrats, lost each time he, you know, was running in the primaries to the establishment, and yet still told us that um, Biden is fit to run for presidency until he was not, and then, completely endorsed Kamala Harris. Like, we got to be aware of, yeah, counterinsurgency from the Democrats parading as leftists. I think more and more of the working class is actually starting to wake up to class consciousness. I know what I'm seeing locally here, organizing with the PSL. Like, there was a lot of people that applied and was interested in the PSL after October 7th, and our branch in particular, basically the number of applicants after Trump was elected was the size of our branch party. So there are definitely people looking for solutions, and I think leftists really need to focus and work on, mobilizing and reaching the working class and finding ways to make it accessible in language that they understand, just like how Trump is able to, have this uncanny ability to synthesize his message that resonates with right wingers and fascists. Like, I think that's something that the left should work on is continually to organize, and um, help meet the needs of the working class locally, nationally, and wherever they are. It's, like we often have the discussion within PSL of like, why don't we focus more on local elections? Well, local elections actually takes money. And as we've seen, like billionaires are able to pour into whatever candidate they want. And that is not something like real leftists are able to challenge. Like, of course, we'll run elections if we are able to, but at the end of the day, like we gotta have this imagination outside of the current electoral system that is at hand, because this current electoral system has brought us to where we are today.
Absolutely. And I also think one thing about the, quote unquote true American left that remains to be seen is a popular front, a some kind of united front, because it remains currently so divided. And even a popular front amongst the Marxists, the PSL, FRSO, or even a popular front amongst like progressive, like we saw the Green Party and the PSL do during the election somewhat. We saw inklings of that when they told each other's supporters to vote for each other, would be so helpful, not only towards organizing within electoral space, which has its obvious limitations, but also organizing outside of the electoral space in terms of community organizing. And I think that's what really needs to be done. First of all, some sort of broad coalition needs to be made, and that's a lot harder said than done. Obviously, it's very easy to say let's just create a coalition. To build that coalition is a very, very big task, and that's why we haven't really seen it. But some sort of leftist coalition, and also organizing within electoral politics, attempting at least. Of course, Tito Senpai has given us the reasons why it's so hard to do it. But organizing within communities. I mean, we need to offer some sort of alternative, and that alternative has to completely divorce itself from the Democrats. The American left, so often has relied on some kind of pushing the Democrats this way, pushing the Democrats that way. And we really have to recognize that the Democrats are ultimately our biggest enemies, as big as Republicans. And the Democratic Party needs to be divorced from the American left, needs to be killed, needs to be, it's a rabid dog that has outlived its usefulness and needs to be put down. I don't even think it was ever useful in the first place. That's too nice to the Democrats. Um, so moving on. Do we think that as America is involved in so many foreign conflicts, do we think the Trump administration will mean something different for how we engage with Israel, Ukraine, and China? Adam, let you go first.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to say because Trump, at the end of the day, I feel like he's mostly talk because he did say that he wants to end the war in Ukraine. And I think a lot of people got, for example, this idea that Trump is going to be a lot more Russia friendly. But I don't think that's necessarily entirely the case because he did also indicate that if Russia won't budge on its promises of either retreating or is currently stopping the war or stopping at basically whatever pieces of land they already grabbed, that they're going to supply Ukraine with more money than the Biden administration ever would. He's kind of putting a front line that like our allies are still aboard and I want to end war, but if you still won't budge, then the things might go different. I think not much is going to change. I don't think Putin is necessarily going to budge as much as Trump. So we could either see the Ukraine war, for example, completely ending or coming to a stalemate at least, or just it becoming even worse than it already is. And when it comes to the case of Israel, I don't see any possible reason as to why Trump would, you know, hold back his support towards Israel. I think Trump is even more pro-Israel than any other president that I have seen or I have experienced as an Arab, for example. The decision to move the embassy into Jerusalem was a very ballsy one that I don't think another president would have done. And I think like he's also even having some plans of further annexing the West Bank. And he's also, Israel's also currently moving with plans to establish its own territories within northern Gaza. And I don't see a reason as to why Trump would stop that. Even if I don't think Trump necessarily blocks Netanyahu, I still think that he will still continue their support and even not supporting them harder than they were. And I think he will even try to suppress pro-Palestinian voices even harder within the United States and globally as well. But I still think the consequences of this genocide have yet to unfold, whether it comes to um, or in many cases that are coming against them, the ICC, the ICJ, and other lawsuits that are going to be coming, which I don't think will stop the United States, but will make it more of a pariah state and isolate the United States even further from its allies. And I think that's what's going to happen. But I don't see him being any less of a warmonger than Biden was.
James?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the larger mechanisms aren't going to shift that much. We'll probably see a little bit of a pivot, I think, more aggressively towards Iran. I would angle. Only because I know that during the initial Trump administration, there were a lot of instances where we came like very fucking close to just like outright fighting, um, or outright like attacks on Iranian soil. Also, I mean, we all remember Soleimani. Like, I think there was a lot of potential there.
Okay. And
Sorry,
oh,
I'm thinking of how I want to frame this. To that end, I think Ukraine will largely stay the same, not because of Trump's personal agenda, but because military industrial complex is making a lot of money, and the it's pretty much what saved the MIC post Afghanistan. And I think like it's just too valuable a weapons testing zone and a weapons testing it's too valuable money wise to actually bring in any kind for Trump to wanna actually do anything in that regard. I think in terms of Palestine, policy probably stays pretty similar as well. I wouldn't be surprised if we see even more amped up efforts on behalf of the Zionist entity, knowing damn well that Trump is, as was previously stated, gonna probably hold course. I think the full-scale annexation of the West Bank is probably the official annexation of the West Bank is probably in the cards, or at least the attempt. I think the continuation of the genocide in Gaza is also likely to continue. I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing other issues, especially as we see flare-ups in Syria and as we continue to see the Israelis violate the ceasefire in Lebanon for whatever that leads to. I think broadly, the only difference is that I think Biden was probably a little bit more anti-China than Trump will be. I really think that liberals in the United States tend to gravitate more in an anti-China actual policy stance than Republicans who tend to be more anti-Iran, although they both are by all means anti-China. But I think Trump is really rhetorically anti-China, but I don't know how many steps he'd actually take as someone who doesn't seem to really dabble beyond rhetoric and a lot of kind of East Asian affairs. But we'll see. I don't know. It's probably going to be fucking chaotic.
absolutely. Tito Senpai?
Yeah, I think, you know, I want to echo what they said. I think Trump will stay the course in Ukraine. I think there's just too much investment there in the military industrial complex, of what James said, and there's just you know too many corporate profits at stake that are there as well. And especially everywhere that BlackRock is involved, like the U.S. empire is going to continue to stay the course. But I do believe that I think things will ratchet up in West Asia, especially since Trump is beholden to Miriam Adelson, who donated $100 million to Trump. I agree with what James said. Like, West Bank is going to be a target in Trump's presidency. I think Iran is, potentially it'll become a direct plot conflict in against Iran, um, all for the sake of appeasing his donor class. The most prominent of which is Adelson, and that's the main thing. Is like, what is the donor class telling Trump to do? I think he'll be loyal to the people that gave him money. Um, and with China, I think the rhetoric will continually to increase, and there'll be more tariffs that we implemented. But at the end of the day, I think even the U.S. empire knows that they can't feasibly win in a conventional direct war with China. So I don't see that playing in the cards. But who knows if the Ukraine conflict or what's happening in West Asia ever goes nuclear, then basically anything is up for grabs. But for the most part, especially with Trump's cabinet picks, like, you know, he is by no means an anti-war president.
Absolutely. Honestly, I think Trump during his campaigns remained so confused. Are we going to refocus our efforts on China? Are we going to draw out of Ukraine, or are we going to support Ukraine? Are we going to let Israel do what it wants and finish the job? During the campaign, he remains very confused about where he's going to take the American empire. But the second he's in office, really what Trump's policies are going to be is whoever gets to his desk first, right? Whichever government bureaucrat, military industrial complex leader gets to his desk first. So I really do doubt, like everybody said, that we're going to see a major de-escalation in terms of America's involvement in Ukraine. But what I do think we will see is a little bit of the foundations of a refocus on China. I think a lot of the American state, and that is part of the tariffs. I think a lot of the American state has been gearing up for decades for an eventual some kind of conflict with China, and we're going to see a little bit of a refocus on that. Does that mean that we're going to draw out of Israel and then we're going to bring peace to the Middle East? No, absolutely not. Trump's going to escalate even more within that region. Does that mean we're going to draw out of Ukraine? For seriously fucking doubt it. But we're going to see the inklings of the beginnings of a refocus on China, which actually began under Obama. If anybody wants to add anything else.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like, oh, did someone say something?
Go ahead. Sorry. No, no,
Uh,
go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with the refocus on China. Like, Trump's rhetoric already says day one, we're going to be slapping these tariffs. And I think like the bourgeoisie of the US empire knows that they eventually have to address the China issue. And, you know, as you said, it's been happening since Obama. The pivot to Asia was his policy. But the thing is, they continually got bogged down in conflicts in West Asia, and then eventually, Biden got bogged down with the Ukraine conflict. I think what Trump will do in West Asia is, allow Israel to escalate, but just as in his first presidency, he was able to establish normalcy ties with other Arab countries. I think we'll finally see Saudi Arabia normalize ties with Israel and more countries in the region do so in order to both strengthen the U.S. empire's hegemony, but also give them the slight flexibility to focus a little bit more on China. But, you know, I, they're thinking of it as if they're still the U.S. empire post Soviet Union collapse. But what they'll find is just they're completely out of their depth in having this three front um, world war that is a world war by any other name besides calling it directly World War III.
Adam?
Yeah, I completely agree. And to echo what you're saying and to add on it, I think America realizes how they can't keep up essentially with what's happening in Ukraine and with what's happening in Israel and potentially with what's going to happen in also Iran. They can't keep up logistically. They can't keep up uh, militaristically. They're already running out of enough ammo for reserves for their own. And I think that's also part of the reason why Biden and Trump wanted to pull out of Afghanistan is because they know that there's going to be a broader regional conflict with China, and they're trying to reserve as much of their weapons and money as possible to address that issue. So while at the same time they do kind of have to address, or they feel I guess, obligated to address the situation in Ukraine and Israel and Iran, there's still the looming threat of China, which they do have to inevitably address. And I think it's the most important one because China is still the greatest threat to the United States empire. So I'm really, worried to see how this will eventually pan out because they they can't keep up. Like we said, America is no longer at its peak the same way it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, and they can't possibly keep up. So it's going to be interesting to see which direction they will eventually take.
Absolutely. James?
Will say it would be fascinating though to see like a fucking end of the genocide and clauses under a Trump administration. I really don't know how Democrats would actually ever come back from that, to be honest.
Oh, that would be absolutely so that would destroy the Democrats. Um, well, I'm out of questions for now. I don't know. I could just throw it to the room. James, you want to yap about the Syrian civil war for a little bit? I was fascinated by that while we were before we recorded.
Yeah, no, that's been a whole damn thing. I've been talking to just a bunch of people that I know who are like Syrian diaspora or like Kurdish, about like different things going on the ground and just following maps basically like hour by hour for the past couple of days. It's really bringing me back to like the Maidan coverage in fucking Ukraine, when I was just like constantly watching live streams of the square for like the entirety of my of, like the time. And yeah, it's fucking wild. And for those or who don't know about this, Syrian opposition forces are pushing very heavily in on Aleppo and really at this point central Syria near Hama, and other areas, and have been making serious advances through what evidently turned out to be a very fragile SAA kind of Syrian military defensive line. And we've seen kind of a break of the quote unquote ceasefire, not really a ceasefire, but the kind of like general zone of operations that had been more or less stagnant over the last like almost 4 years, to a massive shift. I mean, you have similar to like 10 years ago, you have Kurdish forces that are mobilizing really heavily in Aleppo right now, protecting primarily Kurdish majority communities as well as Syrian Christian communities. From what I understand on the ground, from what I've heard from people that I know who are more connected to it, they've been holding the line very effectively. And it seems like YPG and other Kurdish forces are going to be doing their kind of role to repel or to kind of repel any kind of opposition forces from leaking into Kurdish, Kurdish autonomous zones. Um, but I don't know about the rest of it. Opposition forces are really, really moving quickly down into central Syria, and like I don't know what that entails for the Syrian government. Um, it's one of those things though where like it would just like logistically, um, the Syrian military is, I think, more than capable in the long term of repelling these sorts of attacks, and like these rapid assaults aren't really uncommon in the Syrian context. It's just a matter of whether or not opposition forces can actually hold what they obtain for a long period of time, which it's unclear at this point if they actually can. But yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot going on in Syria that could really be a determining factor for a lot of outcomes across the region. I mean, there are a lot of, arms depots and networks that flow or exist flow through or exist in Syria that really do help reinforce and sustain forces like Hezbollah, and others who, though they have domestic production capabilities, do have a lot of, I guess, imports and different equipment imports they have to account for. So, in the midst of continued Israeli aggression in Lebanon, in the midst of continued Israeli aggression in Palestine and Syria. It's a hell of a thing happening right now, to say the very least. Don't really know what it says for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Every time I try to learn about that war, it turns your head. Oh my God, there's so
Syria's
right now.
like
Yeah.
it's really funny. Like, I mean, not it's really not funny, but it's like it's interesting. People always say that like Palestine is complicated, and I always laugh because it's like Palestine might genuinely be one of the least complicated situations that we have in like West Asia. And I would argue, in Adam, throw your hat in the ring here. I would argue like Lebanese history is much more confusing, and complicated than Palestinian history, especially as it pertains to the occupation. I would argue that the Syrian civil war has been in a lot of ways a lot more complicated. Like I cut my chops, like studying like the post-Yugoslavian sphere, and like I can say compared to that, like Palestine's kind of a cakewalk as far as like understanding the actors and players. It's a lot. But yeah, no, it's definitely complicated.
Yeah, it's crazy to see how much of a divide this entire Syrian civil war has not only caused Syria, but also among communities within the Arabic world. You know, you go to any Arabic family dinner and it's something that everyone is conflicted on, whether, Assad is right or the rebel forces are right. They still can't grasp their head at what all of this really means. And I think a lot of it also has to do with like fear, because Jordan is also, the fear at the time was that all these what's happening in Syria might also spill over to Jordan or neighboring countries as well. There are some people that saying, "Oh, Assad is this monster that use chemical weapons against his own people. But then there's also people that recognize this threat of these pretty terrifying Islamists that do commit pretty horrific things, and that they see, what other alternative does Assad have but to defend his nation from, these extremists which are causing a lot of atrocities, a lot of attacks within the area, even in Jordan, like ever since the Syrian civil war, you cannot enter a mall without having to basically have a security check, like the same way you enter an airport, in that sort of sense, because this rise of this Islamic fundamentalism isn't just within Syria, but it's kind of happening all over the Arabic world. And the only reason Jordan has been able to deal with it is because Jordan, I guess, CIA, or equivalent to the CIA, is a pretty powerful organization that constantly cooperates with Mossad, so they're able to keep, certain security issues in place. But a lot of, I think, these reactions are also happening because of the fear of what it also might mean to their own communities. And I don't think there is a direct right or wrong in this scenario. At the end of the day, the only people who are going to suffer are the average Syrians, which, have had enough. But like, this thing is what's happening in Syria is definitely going to spill over to some extent to neighboring countries. We're already seeing a lot of instability in Jordan due to the genocide in Gaza. And God knows what this new conflict in Syria is going to add to all of this.
Absolutely. Tito?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I'm approaching this is, as a Marxist Leninist, I want people of every country to be able to decide for themselves the type of government that they want to have, the type of political system that they want to have. But with the presence of U.S. empires, hyper imperialism all throughout the world, and them continually meddling through regime change or through funding terrorists, like, it is a detriment to the sovereignty of the citizens of those countries that are the target of U.S. imperialism. And I think, like, as seen, the U.S. empire is unrelenting in their quest for resources. They're currently illegally occupying Syrian oil fields right now, and even they lost 3 soldiers through a drone strike from Iraqi resistance in Syria that they falsely claimed that they were based in Jordan. Like, this this is going to continue to happen for as long as U.S. imperialism still exists. And not now, it's not just the strategic goal of gaining resources in Syria through the overthrowing of the Assad regime, but also as suffocating the supply line of the axis of resistance between Iran to Syria to both Palestinian resistance and Hezbollah. And the attack on Syria also allows the Israeli army to reposition and attack Lebanon from another angle because they are continually rebuffed at the border between Lebanon and Israel. So there's a lot that the U.S. empire and by extension Israel has to gain by reigniting the conflict in Syria.
Absolutely. And I'm very much uneducated on this. I'm very surface level. But one thing I will say is it's so odd seeing all these Western politicians and Western people consumed within the Western hegemony who have been crying and screaming about terrorism within Palestine, and everybody who supports Palestine is a terrorist and terrorist this and terrorist that. Very suddenly back Syrian rebels with ISIS flags on their vests, with Salafi Islamist groups within them, and that's who they throw their hat into the ring of. It's been absolutely insane. It's led me to coin the term in a video I posted a while back called the honky hegemony, in which it's okay if we back the terrorists in Syria or people who like is ISIS and ISIS aligned people, as as long as they're on quote unquote our side, and this is
Wait, now hold on. Are you telling me the U.S. funds and supports terror networks? I, I don't believe you, sir.
and it's just I don't know the hypocrisy, the honkocracy is insane, and I'm pretty sure that video's already been taken down by now. But anyways, this has been a very wonderful conversation, guys. I'm just gonna go around the room, tell everybody where to find you, and if you have any final last words, Adam.
Yeah, thank you very much for this podcast. I think like a lot of things have been unfolding recently, and it's really great to talk to all of you guys. I follow you all on TikTok, and it's actually great to talk to you in person. I just want to say, during these tough and difficult times, it's really important to kind of keep focused, not to be overtaken by all these emotions and all this fear, and remember to remember the bigger picture. Try to organize, talk to your neighbors, try to see the world how see the world that you want to build rather than what it currently is. And yeah, it's been a great time. You can always follow me on TikTok if you enjoyed these commentaries at Adam Mappinat, and I hope I can talk to you guys again soon at some point.
Of course, James.
Well, hi everybody. If you want to see my takes on Twitter, my handle is at Good Vibe Politique. You can find me on TikTok at James Gets Political. And ditto, what Adam said. I'm really happy to be on. I'm really happy to talk to y'all. It's really funny kind of seeing y'all pop up on my For You page every now and then being like, oh fuck, these are like real people. So it's definitely nice. But yeah, no, if you want to find me on social media, that's where to go. I also write periodically for Mondoweiss if any of y'all are interested in any of my articles of me just defending Hamas or whatever. But yeah, you can definitely find that there as well.
Absolutely, Tito.
Yeah, I'm on TikTok and Instagram, Tito Comrade, formerly Tito Senpai, but now Tito Comrade for simplistic sake. Yeah, this conversation was really fun. I love being able to uh, have conversations with intelligent people that are critical on what's going on and have similar views as me. Sometimes it can be isolating to just out on TikTok and Instagram on your own, but these type of conversations really help. You know, it is very formative and very, actually fun. So thanks for having me on here, and yeah, I'm glad I got to talk to all of y'all. Yeah.
It's been an absolute blast, guys. I think in these trying times, I'm reminded of Gramsci's great words that we must have a pessimism of the mind, but an optimism of the will. Gramsci was a man who was living under fascist Italy and was jailed for his whole life, and yet he remained optimistic within his will. He recognized that shit was bad, that things were bad, but he realized that there was still a reason to keep on living, a reason to keep on fighting for something better, and that something better was around the corner, even in the darkest of times. It's been an absolute blast, guys. And oh, James, did you want to say something?
Oh, yeah, I was about to say he's a better man than me. I would have crashed the fuck out. Good on him.
It's been an absolute blast, guys. You guys have a wonderful rest of your Saturday.
All right. Peace out. Great talking with y'all.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you. What the fuck? Glory to Stalin, I barely made it. And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Mateus T. If you'd like to also get a shout out, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Subscribing to our Patreon also gets you access to episodes up to a month early.
which is insane because my upload schedule is insane. I'm not gonna lie, fellas.